Welcome to the Social Lights podcast with Kate vanderVoort, where I interview changemakers and innovators on how they connect with their tribe on social media. Brought to you by Social Mediology. Welcome everyone to episode 57 of the Social Lights podcast. I am here today with Venessa Paech. Venessa is Australia's leading expert in online communities and community management. She's led community for Lonely Planet, REA Group, Envato and Australia Post, and her private clients include ABC, AASW, Teach for Australia, QUT, University of Sydney, SANE and Woolworths. Venessa is co-founder and director of Australian Community Managers, ACM, the National Centre of Excellence for Online Community Management Training and Resources. She teaches online community management for postgrads at the University of Sydney, and she's the resident community expert for the Future Work Skills Academy. Venessa is a published academic and a PhD candidate researching AI and online communities. And I'm so excited to be here with you today. Welcome, Venessa.
Hi, Kate. I'm absolutely stoked to be here as well. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
What an amazing bio, and how lucky are we to have someone with such extensive community experience here in Australia. And I'm just so looking forward to digging a bit deeper into all of that amazing experience.
Awesome. No, it's been an interesting and storied journey all over those years that led to that bio you described.
Yeah, well, we will get to that shortly. But tell me first, Venessa, what is it that lights you up? What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Oh man, I've got to be honest. At this point in 2021, coffee. At least some of the days. But no, in all seriousness, I do love what I do, and I know it's an age-old cliche, but I really, really, really care about community, building intentional communities, building them well, helping people connect, generate new value together, and making better lives together, really. And it's kind of as simple as that, and that can be done in a whole range of contexts, as I've sort of explored in my career over the years. And the possibility of doing that and being a help in bringing that to life is just awesome. It's really, really awesome, particularly at this stage of my career when I do have a little bit more choice about the groups that I work with and the clients that I take on and the research that I'm doing. I'm really, really fortunate. I get to do stuff that I really dig. So that's a great motivation to get out of bed and, go bury my head in an interesting book or talk to amazing community builders or help somebody bring some cool project to life.
Yeah, amazing. So tell us, Venessa, a bit about your journey, particularly up to launching ACM, but maybe start with why community, or how did that come about as a passion for you?
Yeah, so look, I did sort of stumble into it, which, in my conversations with community folks over the years is kind of common phenomenon. I think these days it's changing a bit as community does become a more established profession in a lot of organisations. There are more folks who seek it out and train in it, which is great. But, back in the day, we just sort of found ourselves doing the work. So for me, I grew up in Darwin. I was, far away from all this sort of stuff, pre-World Wide Web as well. So, back in the olden days. And I was a performing artist. So I was a singer, dancer, actor sort of kid. I'd performed a lot, local Stedfords, dancing schools, all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to be on Broadway. That was my dream. And then I auditioned for New York University, Tisch School of the Arts, got accepted, which is incredible, sort of went over to America. And while all that was going on, so that was, me fulfilling my dream of being an artist. And as this was happening, the early internet was starting to take shape and become available. So not because I'm a technologist or a coder or any of those things, but I just started to find my way into these communities of interest online through early forums, Usenet, news groups, those sort of things, IRC channels, because I got a computer for school, things like that. So it was just, like many, just sort of falling down that rabbit hole. And though performing and that sort of world was my main thing, my main passion and what I thought I was going to do with the rest of my life, I was incredibly into and fascinated by these digital environments, these early cyber places where humans were connecting from all over the world around things that they cared about or things that they did, and sort of just entranced by the, definitely very romantic utopian early idea of what that could all do and what that could all mean, and making friends and making relationships with all these people. So intellectually and from the heart. I was really being pulled into these spaces and what they could accomplish while still doing my, day-to-day performing. So that love continued, that sort of parallel, concurrent interest continued, these online communities, which I never thought of as a job or an area of study or focus. I was just also engaged with them whilst I was doing my training in New York. And then I became involved in a really seminal community for me called X-Files Anonymous, which was just an early fan community, actually run by Fox TV at the time, which was very forward thinking of them, where I met lots of other X-Files fans in the early 90s, met my husband in that community, which is pretty great. And that's when I met my first community manager. So there was a guy who community managed that. He was a geneticist who'd gone into technology and entertainment, really interesting guy based in California. And I could see, as a user, all the awesome stuff that was happening in this community, and the fact that a business was sort of facilitating it, but wasn't very, they weren't hands-on, they weren't invasive, they were letting the community do its thing. And they had this really talented community manager there to design great engagement and experiences and keep things safe. And I thought that's really interesting what he's doing. I can see what he's doing there. It's facilitation, and he's thinking about the experience, and was starting to create connections, I think, in my mind between the kinds of ways that people come together to create a piece of art and build a culture together and communicate and express, and the sort of patterns I was seeing in some of these environments as well. So that really sparked my interest. And then, long story short, had a bit of a career in the performing arts, and then ultimately decided that it wasn't for me. Was too interested in too many other things. And for me, at least, I felt that I had to be very bloody minded as a performer to succeed. So I was having some success, but as you probably know, if you've ever met an artist, you kind of have to be all in that world. There's no room for half measures. And, I wanted to do more study. I wanted to do more of this computer stuff. I was just interested in it a lot. And so I thought, I don't know that I can keep doing this and only this and give it my all. So then I started to explore opportunities in this space. And then, found myself when I came back to Australia, took up a role as managing editor at Arts Hub, the creative industries portal for many years. And whilst that wasn't a community role strictly, it was in many ways a community role because Arts Hub is a paid membership community of artists who have a really strong sense of community, whose voice wasn't being represented at the time in other media as well. So this digital destination and the discussions and the conversations we would help spark and facilitate there became a really important part of their community and sort of a connective tissue for them. So I got to thinking about community strategy and membership strategy through my work at Arts Hub, and then took my first kind of real, true official community role when I moved over to be community manager at Lonely Planet. And then, the rest is history. So before I knew it, I was community managing all the time and doing nothing else.
And how did ACM come about? What compelled you to create an organisation that brought together community managers?
I think it's that thing that a lot of us go through when we, particularly in terms of a practice or a craft, when we're doing a new thing, it's a very human impulse at some point to go, oh, look, having a moment, this is hard, or is there anyone else I can talk to about this, or just bounce this idea of someone, that desire to connect and exchange ideas and learn from others doing the work. So I went through that like anyone else, sort of in my early Arts Hub and early Lonely Planet days, and was looking around and couldn't really find much out there. There were definitely people building community online, but there was nothing kind of organised happening that I could discover. And the things that I could find were overseas, quite naturally. So, there was some stuff in America happening, there was some stuff in Europe. There was a really great conference in Europe at the time that was very expensive and hard to get to and couldn't really justify at that point. So I thought, well, let's put some feelers out and see if we can build something here. So sort of put the word out through the old-fashioned analog networks more than anything else, talking to friends of friends and asking around, and managed to pull together basically a meetup, a community roundtable of different individuals building and managing communities. And we had that at Lonely Planet back in 2008, 2009. And there we had Essential Baby, Fairfax, we had Foxtel, we had ABC, we had Redbubble, the creative marketplace, we had Disney, I think, Habbo Hotel, really interesting mix of really diverse industries, and these people just like me who were charged with managing these communities, making them successful in different kind of ways and in different contexts. And that was really the seed. Then those roundtables kept happening, grew into larger and larger events, and became, a more formalized network that we now know as ACM. And the gatherings themselves kind of grew into Swarm Conference, which is our big annual get together.
And Swarm's coming up in a couple of weeks for anyone that's interested. So tell us a bit more about Swarm, because I really love how you curate the speakers and how you bring people together about that. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. It's, you know, and anyone that's ever run an event knows how hard it is, you know, and in some ways harder online. Certain things are easier when you do it online, certain things are harder. And we do try to make it very, very intentional. Look, it's probably a little bit like when you're the founder of a company, you know, the company you create, in many cases, I think becomes a little bit of an echo or a reflection of the founder's personality and values. And I think it's the same when you're doing an event. So consequently, there's a lot of me in Swarm, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. It depends where you sit, I guess. So my passions, as you can tell from this conversation, you know, I'm a bit of a nerd. You know, I'm doing my PhD. I like the academic stuff. I like a good intellectual read about all of this, and I like doing the work. And I, you know, as a female on the internet, you know, I've seen a lot of really not so great stuff over the years, and I know a lot of people working in high risk and marginalized communities online as well. So all of those sort of factors have contributed to the way that I've set about shaping Swarm over the years. So I never wanted it to be, you know, straightforward kind of digital marketing event, although I certainly wanted all the content to be really useful for anybody doing that as well. I really wanted to make it community is the through line here. So anybody who is practicing the art and the science of community, gathering people together, you know, driving them and mobilizing them toward objectives or goals, measuring how well that's happening. Is it healthy? Is it successful? What are the outcomes? Thinking about community strategically in different ways. How do you manage risk and safety? All of those different bits and pieces that represent, you know, the craft of community management in any context. So if you're working in a mental health forum, if you're working for a big customer community, a brand community, a startup community, you can take valuable lessons and apply them to your work. So I wanted to make it really very multidisciplinary, and also a little bit nerdy. So right from the start, you know, we've tried to build in some relationships with really great researchers and policymakers who are often kind of making decisions and conducting investigations that impact our online communities, impact our lives on social media in different ways. And community builders are often, you know, not in those rooms having those conversations. So I was quite keen to try to connect these groups. I would talk to academics who would say, this amazing paper and the stuff I'm working on, if only I could talk to, you know, somebody who was managing a community, that would really bring this work to life. Or I just don't know where to find those sort of people. Do those people exist? Is that a thing? And then I talked to community builders who would say, you know, I'm seeing these patterns and trends, and is that a thing? Like, is that a phenomenon? Can I learn more about that? Is there a different way to think about this or conceptualize this? And so it seemed obvious to me that these groups would benefit from talking to one another. So we've always had kind of an academic layer to Swarm as well, for those that want to go there with some research and sort of connecting, for example, you know, the professors and the researchers doing all the really groundbreaking work on things like hate speech online. We'll have them involved in Swarm conversations and discussions with community managers or social media managers about how, you know, how hate speech actually shows up online and how we can work together to build better strategies to combat it, things like that. We've also been really intentional in terms of trying to build, of course, you know, a very diverse and inclusive lineup. Community management in Australia as a profession is really female dominated. So searching for great women has not really been an onerous task. We do an annual survey every year, some research for ACM, a career snapshot, and that particular bit of research has shown that it's female dominated by a landslide. It's about 75%, and every year that ticks up, partly because of the industries that community falls in here in Australia. So finding great women, not so challenging, but, you know, increasingly we want to make sure that all voices are represented. So, you know, last year, for example, we had some really phenomenal Indigenous scholars and practitioners sharing First Nations community building techniques and knowledge in ways that is permissible and suitable for non-First Nations and Indigenous communities to use and apply. Because there's so much incredible ancient knowledge there that, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are some things that we should be paying attention to and not trying to rewrite, and definitely not trying to own or colonize. So, you know, just creating those sort of subject matter diverse and sort of topically diverse, industry diverse conversations has always been a really big objective of Swarm. The other thing we try to do is keep it pretty grounded. So whilst there is a bit of academia and a bit of thinking involved, it is all rooted in clear kind of takeaways that if you come along to Swarm, you can go, right, I've got this new playbook, I've got this list of things, I've got a new way to think about this problem. I sat in a room with some incredible people and sort of met this challenge that I had, or they helped me solve this problem that I have, so that you get really tangible value right away. And obviously with any gathering or conference, you get to meet great people and build great relationships.
Oh, there's so many things in what you've just said that I want to unpack further. And I love in your story that, I think every community manager that I interview on this podcast, and I think every great community that I've ever come across, has been created because there was a gap or a need that the founder or the community manager themselves found. And so I love that, you wanted to create a community to support you in that professional role. And there are literally, I can see like 5 or 6 forks in the road here in terms of our conversation. But just on that around professionalism with community managers, I really feel like the time of community has finally come. I know that it's been here for a long time, and that there are some of us who've been working in this space for a long time, but it feels like it's more recognized now. Before we get to that, though, can you talk to me about your view on the difference between, say, social media marketing and community, and even a little bit around the definition of community, because I think it's a term that's thrown around a lot. So I've asked you probably 5 questions in one there.
Right, we can connect them all up. It's all good.
Oh, at doing that.
So no, and it is an important point, and I do think that so sort of tackling that, that distinction between social media, community, marketing, all those different layers, it's complicated and it's layered because there's a lot of natural overlap. There is, right? We'd be silly if we try to deny that. Also, in a country like Australia, which is a relatively small place with relatively few people compared to the rest of the world, and we are, as all of your listeners know, hugely kind of voracious users of social media, or I think we're the biggest Facebook users in the world still from the latest stats. Facebook and these platforms and social media is ubiquitous in our lives. They are a social infrastructure for us in a whole bunch of ways. So it's inevitable that community building is going to happen on them. And for a lot of, particularly people that aren't necessarily doing it professionally, when they think about community or an online community, they're going to think about how they gather and show up and engage on those platforms and those spaces. And for those of us who do it professionally, there are a lot, there's hundreds of community platforms for different sort of purposes that we might want to build, and there's clear advantages and disadvantages to building on all of them in social media platforms. But ordinary people are just thinking about community and relationships, and that's where a lot of it plays out. So I think that's part of what makes it complicated. I guess to answer that bigger question about the distinction, they're both incredibly important, and they're both just different disciplines. I think why it's important to distinguish them before we try to define them is that what they're trying to accomplish is quite different, and how you measure success is quite different. So I've seen both amazing social media managers and great community managers kind of get tripped up and tied up in knots because either them or their managers or their companies are sort of asking them to do things and be measured in certain ways that actually aren't really aligned with what they're doing, the actual practice of what they're doing. So if I'm hired to build a community and I've got a boss who's saying your KPI is reach on this platform, well, certainly reach can be sometimes an outcome of certain types of communities, but it's actually not what communities as a social structure are really good at. They're actually sort of the opposite of that. They're really good at going deep relevance. Groups and networks are reach, right? Networks in particular are all about reach. It's why social platforms are so great at that stuff. So if reach is the objective, if you're a community strategist and you get to talk to that person before they do any of these things, what do you want to accomplish? Why do you want to accomplish all those key strategic questions? And if they say, we just, we want to get the word out, we want awareness, we want reach, we want all of those things, then building a community is probably not the right first step. Maybe it's a step down the track, but maybe you want to do some incredible marketing, some really far-reaching outreach sort of stuff. And sure, some of that's going to involve building relationships, but then potentially you can look at a community play or a community strategy later on that is doing the things for you or your organization that community is good at, which is, deep loyalty, ideation, collaboration, kind of knowledge generation between people, mobilizing people to do stuff together. There's so many community is good at from a sort of sociological point of view. And in business and organizations, there's a whole bunch of stuff it's really good at. And most of them are quite different to the things that marketing is great at. So you can go on social media and create a phenomenal marketing presence and just create magnificent content, hit all the, hit all the winning boxes. And that's awesome. And people will be inspired and they might feel loyalty to the product and you might get all of those outcomes that you want. But unless you're actually kind of trying to create peer-to-peer relationships, which most people, that's not what they're trying to do when they're doing a great marketing campaign. You're probably not building a community. You're building a really engaged, connected, inspired audience that's ready to follow you into the fold and buy your latest product and do your latest thing. And that's great. It's just, it's a whole different thing. So sort of right down to the sociological level, the structures are different. You measure success differently. And social media managers are often in this weird position, particularly in Australia, where they're asked to do a bit of both. So it feels funky. They're like, okay, so you want me to sort of, I'm here to represent the brand, to sell stuff. Sometimes they're asked to take on sort of a customer service role as well. Then they're asked to moderate, which is often an aspect of community management in some ways, but they're not usually charged with, let's go and build peer-to-peer relationships. We want to create a new community or work with an existing community to achieve these particular goals together in this way. So obviously, if you're measuring that and you're measuring a community, you're looking at, are those relationships happening? How many? What is the social density of those relationships? Is it a healthy community? Is the value that you're looking for actually being generated in a shared or equitable way versus things like, likes, shares, reach impressions, all those sort of things, which are a success indicator for marketing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are clear distinctions and both practices can complement one another. If you're an incredible marketer who creates great content, that's a really useful skill if you're a community builder as well. And likewise, if you're going to go and work as a social media marketer, knowing how to handle a crowd, how to moderate, knowing how to really kick off and spark great conversations is a great way to generate engagement. But, I think community builders sometimes get a bit concerned that the language of community is sort of co-opted for sometimes less than ethical purposes, maybe some extractive purposes, and we sort of show up and want to take from our audiences without necessarily giving back. So to me, that's a big distinction. Is community is really reciprocal. It's about how can we work with these people, how we can generate new stuff together, but it's very much about mutual exchange, mutual value exchange. What are the needs and wants and sort of desires of both groups, and how can we make something awesome happen? Why are we the best organization to facilitate this particular community about this particular thing? And how can we get at the heart of that rather than how can we show up and make a bunch of people do a specific thing?
And I think, one of the things that I love about the journey to community is often community ends up being a byproduct of marketing almost. Like I've seen so many amazing marketers and I've worked with clients myself where they've absolutely approached all of this technology from a marketing perspective and then kind of accidentally grow a community. And there becomes a natural point where it's like, okay, this is something we really need to invest in because our people are telling us, our customers, our community are telling us this is something that they want from us.
Yeah, and as you say, it's organic, it's come from them. There's a need that they're expressing and there's a clear opportunity there that then you can rise up and meet, rather than companies who sometimes approach it the opposite way and to say, we want to make a community because we have a need for what we think a community can give us. And I'm not saying that's wrong. A lot of people do that, but it is ultimately kind of a bit of an extractive mindset, and it usually doesn't work. They're going to be disappointed because it's not organic.
And I know you and I have had this conversation before, but in our business, I kind of sit one foot in each camp, and I see myself as a bit of a disruptor who's blurring the lines to help businesses where it's really obvious that community is of benefit, but they haven't even thought about it yet. And so I start blurring the lines around the edges of marketing Because it's a natural progression for them
Absolutely,
to
No,
go.
it's the perfect gateway drug for community.
I love that.
Absolutely.
Oh, I might have to use that one.
And I think, you're right, when you're talking about the language, right, the term, it's hard to define. There are, look, there are dictionary definitions of community. Traditionally we think of community as very, as a geographically tethered kind of idea. Our physical communities, obviously you've got communities of purpose, communities of practice, communities of interest. There's all sorts of communities. There is something about the social structure that is specific and defined. It's, those peer-to-peer relationships, that mutual concern, and there's some great definitions out there to help give that shape, as distinguished from those other types of groups like an audience or a network. So it's about knowing what you might want to build and why, and what those different things are good at. And as you said, kind of, if you can sort of get past I think sometimes the word community is suffering from a bit of baggage, I think. To some it feels too vague and too nebulous. You're like, well, what is that? What does that actually mean? What's the value in it for me? And then for others, it feels too wishy-washy. And you and I know that's a shame and that's not accurate. But for some, it might, particularly if you're thinking from a purely business point of view, you're like, well, community, that sounds great. Like, yeah, I want social capital, I want goodwill, I want all these things, but I'm trying to stay afloat in a pandemic and I've got stuff to do. And how is that really going to help me right now? So, kind of getting very concrete, call it something else if you want, if the language is the obstacle, but just, find how creating and facilitating these relationships in a strategic way, in connection with what you do, can generate so much value for a business and so much kind of organizational value. There is clear and real ROI there. It's codifiable. There's research that proves it. We're not making this up, but I think a lot of people do sort of stop at the word and go, that feels a bit kind of warm and fuzzy, and I don't really know how to do that, or maybe that's not where I should be prioritizing my time right now. Then it's a shame.
Well, and the irony is that those that do community really well, marketing and sales is a byproduct of that.
Yeah, so much easier, isn't it?
Do it well.
And you and I both know clients and businesses out there who, who've gone down that community journey and built it out authentically and smartly and mindfully, who are now, spending a fraction of what they used to spend on things like marketing and sales, because their community's kind of carrying that with them now and for them. They've got natural ambassadors, they've got really strong communities of users for their products or their services, and, their costs are going down and the value's going up.
So one of the things I'm always interested in when I'm interviewing a community manager within a particular business, and you've obviously got a cross-section across many, is this concept of where community sits in the business and what it means to the business. And I look at some of the brands that you've worked with and I kind of go, I don't actually think of them much as a community. So can you talk a bit about that? I won't name any of the particular brands, but could you talk a little bit about how different businesses and how you help businesses to identify where it sits and what it means to the business?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you're right. You're right in your assessment there. And I think so. I'll talk a little bit about Lonely Planet as an example. So when I came to work at Lonely Planet, I was hired as community manager for their Thorntree forums initially. So it was very specific. It was really manage this existing community, long established before I got there. I think it was 10 years old before I even arrived. So hugely established community, only was retired very recently. It lasted, kind of 20 years, amazing space. And that was it, right? So, and my role fell under the digital editorial department. So it wasn't a marketing team. It was, and I think Lonely Planet as a publisher was a little unique in that way, although there are clearly marketing aspects to all of that stuff. Mine was an editorial role, and mine was kind of a community engagement editorial role. Make this community safe, successful, effective for its participants and the organisation. And increasingly, as I work there, think about our strategic relationship with this community. So this community is sitting there as this really powerful asset. We're letting that happen. There are benefits for the business in terms of traffic and loyalty and ideas generated and a whole bunch of other stuff. But what else? Is that it? Are we just going to sort of do that for, a couple of decades? And that's great. That's perfectly fine value. So a big part of my job became bridging some of those strategic gaps within the organisation, thinking about ways we could do more with our community, that they wanted to participate in, of course. How can we co-create? Can we make products together? We've got, for example, we had an amazing sub-forum in the community called Get Stuffed, that was this food and recipe branch, of the tree, where amazing folks from all over the world would get together and share their different cultural recipes and hang out and talk about food and make recommendations. For absolute goldmine of content and advice and insights. And Lonely Planet wants to do a recipe book. Well, then why don't we go and collaborate with those folk and actually do a co-created community product? Gives them those that want to be involved an awesome sense of being able to take ownership of that and work on something cool. It's reward and recognition for all of their, the time and the labor and that energy that they've spent building up that community repository over the years. And Lonely Planet gets to bring something new into the world that nobody else has. Nobody else has relationships with these people. So that's, kind of a mutual payoff. So that was a big part of it. And it was in that organisation done with that editorial lens more than anything else. Other organisations, it often does fall under that marketing, sometimes customer servicey kind of customer support umbrella. But all of this is changing. So historically, it's definitely been out on a limb somewhere. I would say it's either been a marketing limb or a customer support limb, or in that case, an editorial limb. Sometimes not really a sales limb per se, but perhaps a growth and business development limb, particularly for a startup or something. But I'm seeing in the market increasingly, particularly with our international colleagues, but here in Australia too, people are starting to think about community much more holistically, which is good. They should be, because it is actually a very ensconcing kind of concept, a very enveloping concept that does touch every department. One of my fellow community managers over in Germany, Tanya Laub, who runs sort of the German equivalent of ACM, she's once described, the community managers as the human API, right, for an organisation, kind of fingers in every plug and play with everyone and everything, right? And others describe as, the central nervous system. I've once described it as the air traffic controller. You are all of those things. So by virtue of the fact you are this interface with communities of partners, users, customers, staff, whoever that is, you really are plugged into all the ideas and knowledge and relationships floating around an organisation and its ecosystem. So you in a really community as a department is in a unique position to help cohese and organise and apply that lens in ways that are useful for the business or useful for the organisation. So we are seeing more of these sort of, as my another colleague of ours overseas, Adrian Speyer, head of community high logic, he talks about this, the rise of these centres of excellence that are really centering, sort of what used to be kind of a CX customer experience lens, kind of taking it next level and actually making it community. So for some that means concrete community programs. We've got a forum over here, we've got a partner program over here, we work with this group over here in these ways. It's always multiple things, but it also means how do we apply the insights being generated from our community to every single aspect of our organisation to enrich everything that we're doing. I think that's the kind of potential that's there. It's a lot to take on for an organisation in the early stages. You've got to go through some steps first, of course, but that potential awaits. And I do think we're having a shift from community as sort of a bit of a bolt-on department that is often sometimes kind of absorbed up under some of those other titles and can sort of get stuck there strategically. Like you can do great work and generate good outcomes, but sort of the potential's not really fulfilled because it's really ultimately sort of tied up in a corner versus thinking about this a little bit more holistically and thinking about how do our relationships with these people, how do the insights that are being generated, the new products, the new ideas, the innovation capability, how can we really just sort of unleash all of that with a more encompassing lens?
Yeah, wow. Again, I have a million thoughts going on in my head that we could discuss. Because Lonely Planet, to me, that's a no-brainer. It's bringing people together about something they're passionate about, travel,
absolutely,
whatever those.
Travel lovers the world over.
Yeah, and travel guides. God, I'm fondly remembering what my bookshelf used to look like in my 20s. I had shelves of Lonely Planet guides.
Yeah, no, still got on mine.
We got travel now, but I don't have any.
Back when we could move in the before times. Yeah.
But then when you look at other brands, again, not mentioning any names, but things like banks and supermarkets and those kinds of businesses. How do you see that community can, and I get that it's different because, and this is what I love about the work I do, I'm sure it's the same for you, every business is unique, and it's almost like there's this magic sauce that when you find it, what is that thing that people are really passionate about that brings them together? And you can pretty much find it I find you can find it in pretty much every business.
Yeah.
But how, for those who are listening who I guess are not in the really obvious community space, how can community come about for them?
Yeah, no, it's a great way to think about it, because I do think a lot of people think this, they're like, this is really cool and interesting, but I just can't see it. Like, how do I make my washing detergent company? How do I build a community around that? Come on, I'd love to, but what do I do?
I use a washing machine analogy, so you go with
there you go. But to take that, I'll take a hypothetical detergent company just for 1 minute, and then I'll answer your question more specifically. If you've got, I've used this example with some of my students sometimes. If you've got a detergent company and sort of their branding and their motto and their goal in the world is to save people time. There's an efficiency about this product, and they're like, we want to make this way less painful. Yes, it gets everything super clean, but it's really efficient, and it's all about saving you time. They can turn around potentially. They don't have to go and create a product-centric community, right? They don't have to create a community of people to exchange washing detergent tips, although they could potentially, maybe that would work. First thing, of course, as you know, is always to actively listen, right? To put your ear to the ground and to listen to what people are actually talking about. What do they want? What do they need? And you can do that through, that's another example of where social media interlaces with this. If you go and examine the zeitgeist, see who are your known customers or prospective desired customers, and what are they talking about? What do they care about? And go and find the sweet spot between what they want and need and what's motivating them and what you do and what you know about. So maybe if you're all about time saving and you have access to a lot of experts, you could go and create a really cool productivity community that happens to have your branding, but it's actually not at all about washing detergent, but it's just about household time saving, time hacks, and have a whole bunch of amazing experts come into there and offer AMAs and advice and have people share knowledge and do sorts of fun activities and gatherings and make life easier for all those people for whom that is a priority. And it's an extension of your brand values and your brand narrative, but it's not about your detergent exactly. So you can approach it really left of center like that. You don't have to make it literally about the thing that you do. That sweet spot approach is my advice. Go and think about who you are in the world, what you make, what you do, what you bring to things, who are your existing customers, networks, communities, people you might want to talk to. And sometimes it's about working with existing communities as well. Building a community is incredibly rewarding, as we've talked about, but it is hard work and it takes a while. That's the other difference. Social media can deliver pretty quick results sometimes because it's so impactful and so viral, but community building takes time. The results compound and they're awesome, so that it's worth it, but it's not an easy win. It takes a little bit of time. So if you need quicker results or are interested in a different approach, maybe there are existing communities that are already established, don't have to be professional ones or ones from another brand, just organic communities of humans on the internet that you can go and discover that have similar interests or want to do similar things, or maybe they've got something that they could offer your customers or vice versa. Go and think about reciprocal relationships. Go and think about value exchanges. What do people know? What are they good at? What do they need? And how can you gather them or facilitate that gathering or that exchange in a way that's going to deliver value for those people? So make their lives better, easier, just help them in some way. So doing that brokering, that's really where in my view, you start. And you can, like I said, go and work with existing communities, and sometimes that's a powerful way to plug into community endorsement and achieve sort of start to see some of the wins that investing in community can give you without having all that initial overhead of having to build a community. And it helps you get good at it and understand it, and then you might find the opportunity area for you to hone in on to build your own community around a very specific piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, fantastic. It's just always for me such a fascinating process, helping companies come up with what that looks like and what's actually going to be meaningful. And nothing annoys me more than people that try fabricate community, because it never works.
Yeah, I think I've heard that. I think Karen Melissa Jones, another great community builder in the States, she calls them mirage communities. I think it's such a great, it's a great way to describe it, right? I think the question to ask is, in my view, is probably something like, how will this be better or different if we bring people together versus on their own? So what new thing happens, whether it's an experience or an emotion or something that is created, a product, a thing in the world, what happens when we connect these people together versus letting them stay on their own as they are now? That also will let you know if there's sort of a business case for community there. And sometimes there's not. I agree with you. I think most of the time there is a real opportunity there, but not always. It's got to be applied, like everything. It's got to solve a problem. So it's got to be applied to a real problem, a real challenge, and help meet that opportunity. And
have the right intent.
Definitely. Yeah. If you do approach it from more of that kind of extractive mindset, as some do, it's ultimately not. It's usually not going to work to begin with. And if you sort of get some initial success, it generally doesn't sustain because it's not intrinsic. It's not organic.
Now, I have a question that's percolating in my head, but not fully formed. So bear with me. You mentioned earlier around gender and the number of women who naturally come to the role of community manager. And it's a no-brainer. Women, stereotypically, women like connecting, like talking, like coming together around the table. One of the challenges that I sometimes bump up against, and I would love your reflection on that, is that often the decision makers in a business or a company, or those that are trying to guide the strategy, are not necessarily female. And because they are not participating in these amazing, thriving communities that generate really tangible outcomes in a lot of situations, if they haven't experienced it, it's very hard for them to understand the value and the benefit of that. And so I'm not even sure what my question is, other than I know it's something that I bump up against a lot. And I'm interested in your reflection on that. I hate making things about gender, but it really plays out in this place because female communities are very, very different on social media on social media, I'm talking about mostly here, and more of the public communities. Very, very different to some of the other more closed or curated communities that exist.
Yeah, I think it's worth reflecting on, right? I think there's something there. There's a whole bunch of questions and ideas there that are worthy of more inquiry, is how I would respond to that. I think that I think you're right. There are, as we know and research bears out, there are some issues in terms of gender representation, or let's say diverse representation across companies and organizations up and down the hierarchies, CEOs, boardrooms. We know those issues exist. And you're right. Ultimately, a lot of those decisions about, that's the thing we should invest in, or let's give that, every chance to succeed, are made by people that might not understand the value, or might not even really be able to grasp the thing.
And that's completely separate to gender, really, because you're right. There's a lot of people who haven't experienced.
And it happens with race. It happens with everything, right? We get people
male and female. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. So that's definitely a problem, and I do see community builders come up against that. And I think there was an interesting article that actually came off the back of our research a few years ago, where we were talking with some journalists about this, and there was this sort of question raised, very provocative question, interesting one, but is community building women's work? Intentionally a provocative phrase, right? But this idea that they weren't saying that sincerely, but they were saying is that how it's being perceived? And what are the problems with that? Or, if that is indeed accurate. And I think there's something there. I think that, I mentioned the warm and fuzzy language problem before. I think that just as social sciences, arts, humanities, all these sort of things have had a perception problem, which is ironic, seeing they're really the most in-demand skills of the future, the things that can be more challenging to automate. They're seen as soft, they're seen as kind of easy, they're seen as, less productive. The ways that we ascribe value and measure time and measure money and all these sort of things, they don't fit those boxes neatly. So they've been traditionally marginalized or dismissed. It's like, no, they're less value because this is the paradigm we're operating in, and this is less valuable because of that. And I think community building gets trapped in there a lot as well. I think, there are certain communities, you and I both know, where they're, really they're transactional. They're clearly generating a whole bunch of money, a whole bunch of opportunity, a whole bunch of ROI, and so it's of course easier to have those conversations about, hey, yeah, we need to invest more in this. It's a clear revenue generator for the company, or it's saving us all this money, or whatever the ROI looks like. But the communities where the value is more intangible, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just sort of means we haven't institutionally in our workplaces, we haven't got the common language about how to measure it yet. That's the main thing, I think. That's a big challenge, right? And I do think that we suffer from that. And I think that holds opportunities back. It holds individual community builders and leaders back. It holds the potential of communities for organizations back. When it's seen as a nice to have, it's a warm and fuzzy, it's sort of a PR exercise, or it's soft, it's easy. It's the same with social media, which had that reputation for years of, let's give it to the intern. It's like, no. Social media marketing, you are the doorstepping your political doorsteps that you do with journalists, a press conference. That's the door to the world, right? Your person on that channel, that person sitting there being that interface with the world, is representing your company potentially to people all over this planet. So it's not that an intern couldn't do that, but you better be picking the right person for that job, and you better be taking it seriously. And there are people that have expertise, and you better be hiring them well and paying them properly and all the rest of it, because it's real work. It's not futzing around on the internet and maybe generating some nice vanity metrics. It was never that. So I think social media's also suffered from a related perception problem in that way. So I don't have an easy answer. I think, continuing for community managers and community builders, continuing to build our literacy around value. And yes, the traditional ROI value generation of, neoliberalism and market economies. Yes, we do that because that value exists and we need to have those conversations. But equally so, we need to be on the front lines of inventing the new language around value and working with other types of scientists and scholars and policy folk and clever people to figure out how to have a different conversation about value. How do we value Indigenous wisdom? How do we value sense of belonging? How do we value these sort of things? Because they are really valuable and we feel it really acutely in the middle of a pandemic, right? So we've got to start valuing that stuff. And organizations, I do think, are starting to wake up to that. They're starting to be keen to discover and explore these things. I actually started to work quite a lot in the last year with organizations who have shifted their workplaces online, and then, start out wanting a sort of practical, we need an online space where we can gather. So we basically need an online community to start to work and collaborate and do all these things, and they'll go get some tools, but then, people aren't really engaging, or they still feel disconnected. They're self-reporting that they don't really feel like they belong. They don't feel safe. The culture still feels weird or off, and they don't know what's happening. And it's because, they're not thinking about, we need to actually now steward a digital culture. We need to think about that. So they're becoming community managers, these leaders, these team leaders, these CEOs, in a hybrid way. So they're actually having to draw on the community builders playbook for that work. So I think that more and more as we learn to make those transitions, we're going to recognise those same leaders who maybe were a little sceptical or resistant to that are going to realise, actually, that is really important, because when this doesn't happen, I don't get all of these other outcomes that I need. So investing in culture is really important, and I need to do it online too, and I need to think about belonging and social health. And wow, look at this research. When the social health looks like this, the organisation's this much more resilient to change. And gee, that's going to be a problem we have to get really good at. So all those connections are starting to be made, but I do think we're just sort of at the beginning of that adventure.
Yeah, it's certainly a fascinating time to be involved in community, and I think the current global situation has fast-tracked a lot of those things that would have taken a lot longer to be given priority. Now, I had a whole lot of strategic and tactical type questions for you, which I think what I'm going to do is invite you to come back another time for that conversation.
That because I've talked your ear off. I have, haven't I? Sorry.
No, not at all. I love our conversations. But I always like to finish up with, what's your favourite community? Where do you love to hang out and be a part of in terms of online communities?
Oh, that's such a good question. I had someone else ask me this recently, and I was actually momentarily stumped. And I was talking to a fellow community builder and they said, oh, maybe it's a thing. Like maybe we community builders don't do it so much because it's our work and we don't hang out in communities so much. I think that's true to an extent. Look, for me, it's I am a nerd, self-professed nerd, as I said earlier. So I love my genre entertainment. I like my sci-fi. I like my Marvel movies. I like all that sort of stuff. So I get a lot of pleasure and joy and escapism in those sort of communities. So whether they're, there's actually some really good communities off the back of some YouTube content creators that I'm involved in across a few different channels and platforms who I love, and they make me, it's just, they produce great content. I have fantastic conversations and celebrate what we all love together with those folk. So that's sort of escapist joy. And the other one I would shout out to is community cooperative that I'm involved in with a number of our fellow community builders overseas in different countries who sort of, I guess, are similarly aligned from a values point of view. We want to try to build better communities. We want to kind of, improve the environment for everybody. We're all trying to sort of help uplift stuff and do better, basically. So I spend time with them regularly. They're both asynchronous and synchronously. We hang out and learn from each other and share stuff and do group writing exercises, and just, it's as a little community of practice. I find it really rewarding, and those folk just inspire me no end on days where it's all a lot. So those are the two sort of main little patches I hang out with at the moment. And of course, our own community with ACM, which, kind of, goes without saying, I adore them, and every time I'm hanging out with them, they're fantastic as well.
I love that you met your husband in an X-Files group. Yeah. I remember back, as you were talking, I was thinking back to, being 18, 19, and I think my first dating experiences then were in MSN chat rooms.
Absolutely. My husband, he proposed to me in the traditional sense, but we staged a proposal in an IRC chat room with our friends. It had like people from the X-Files involved in the chat. It was amazing. I've still got the transcripts printed out because
that's fantastic.
It was pretty cool. It was really good. They were great days. I was reflecting with some folks recently. We made the news because that was really unusual back then. And so he was in America, he's a former American, and I was in Australia. So the whole idea that people couldn't meet and fall in love across the interwebs was very foreign. So we had this little story in the newspaper over in America, and we actually got on the news briefly.
Oh, fantastic.
I'm using 5 minutes of fame, where they were like, American, area man meets, Australian woman on the information superhighway. It was great. And we went in the paper. I remember we were next to Tickle Me Elmo, which is that gives you a bit of an indication of how old this all is. But hey, it's not that long ago. A lot has changed very quickly. I'm going to stand for that.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Venessa. I can highly recommend, and it's essential reading for anyone in community if you haven't already, or those who are wanting to start community. The ACM annual survey is jam-packed full of amazing insights, and definitely always worth reading. And for those who are interested in connecting with other community people and learning more about building and growing community, definitely the Swarm Conference, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. So we will put the links to both of those in the show notes so it's easy for people to find.
Thanks, Kate. Really appreciate that. And we'll hope to have some great conversations in the digital hallways with you there.
Thank you for joining us on the Social Lights podcast, produced by Social Mediology. You can connect with us on Facebook at Social Lights Podcast, and you can find today's show notes and more episodes at socialmediology.com.au/social lights. Please subscribe in your favourite podcast platform to receive future episodes, and share with your tribe to inspire others to action.